Restaurant owner visits his restaurant and the staff was clueless. Everything changes for a famous and wealthy restaurant owner when he is faced with the prospect of his impending death. He wants to do one last act of kindness before he leaves this world, but he must first figure out who is deserving of his kindness. He decides that the best way to find out is to dress up as a homeless person. He visits various restaurants to see how his staff will react. But not even in his wildest dreams could he have predicted what he would learn from his small experiment and how it would change John's life. The nerves raged through John's body. He'd been to nearly every one of his restaurants in town and still hadn't found the person he was looking for. Everything came down to this. He stepped into the restaurant after taking a deep breath. Any remaining hope John had vanished as soon as he walked into the restaurant. Nothing seemed to be different here, and John was getting ready to leave. He could barely conceal his dissatisfaction, but then he saw her, and everything changed for him. He hadn't expected it, but he knew right away that this was the person he needed. John was ready to tell her everything because she was perfect. But who is this mysterious young lady? And why was John looking for her in the first place? A little background information is required to fully comprehend this. John is a 78-year-old man whose life has been defined by his greatest passion, being the owner of a high-end restaurant chain, restaurants that are well known throughout the country. However, little is known about John outside of his work in the industry. John is a reserved individual who places a high value on his personal space. People are unsure whether this is because he has something to hide or because it is simply part of his personality. However, as we learn more about his life and childhood, some possible explanations emerge. John didn't have much time to make friends when he was younger. His father was building an empire in the fine dining world, and as a result, the family was constantly moving across the country, never staying in one place for long. During this time, John developed a strong admiration for his father and desired nothing more than to follow in his footsteps. Almost everything he did was focused on this goal, and there was little room for anything else. But John had not expected his chance to arrive so quickly. When John was only 25 years old and still living with his parents, his father became ill unexpectedly, and his father's health quickly deteriorated. It became clear that he would pass soon, and a major decision had to be made. Despite the fact that it was much earlier than the family had anticipated, it was decided that John would be in charge of the restaurants, with his mother keeping a close eye on things. John's father passed away not long after this decision. He was only 48 years old at the time. John dedicates his entire life to realizing his late father's dream, and he is successful. He was able to make his restaurant chain a national success while also making a lot of money in the process. But there are some significant disadvantages to all of this. John had no real friends at the moment because he had been consumed by work for the previous 50 years and was still quite shy. Aside from that, the majority of his family had either passed away or he had lost contact with. John felt very isolated. John had not had any friends or family for many years, and he had also never been in a romantic relationship. Most of the women he dated were only interested in him because of his wealth, and John was fed up with it. He only desired to concentrate on his work. And John made a lot of money as a result of his laser focus on making his business a success. His father had left him a successful restaurant chain, but John's own ideas and clout propelled the company to new heights. It was everything he'd ever wanted, but he'd come to regret his decision. John is 72 years old at this point, but despite this, he has no intention of retiring. He's still dedicated to making his restaurants more successful, but fate has a big surprise in store for John that will completely change any and all short-term plans he has. John had been feeling increasingly ill recently, but he had managed to ignore it for the most part. He disliked going to the doctor and tried to avoid doing so unless it was absolutely necessary. But unfortunately, this would soon be the case. John awoke one day with a stomachache that rendered him nearly immobile. He didn't see any other choice but to call for an ambulance to take him to the hospital. A doctor examined John thoroughly to determine the source of his discomfort, and he arrived at a very sad and troubling conclusion. John was suffering from an infection that had progressed to a critical stage. Because he waited so long to see a doctor, the infection had grown out of control, and there was nothing a doctor could do to help John at this point. The doctor told John that while he couldn't give him an exact date, He predicted it would be a matter of months, if not weeks. John was given a lot of medication to help him stay as pain-free as possible at home, but he would eventually have to go to the hospital to spend his final days. John began to reflect on his life and the decisions he had made along the way home. A sense of sadness and regret began to creep into his mind. He realized he had squandered his life on this planet by pursuing financial gain. He began to sob uncontrollably. John had amassed a large fortune over the course of his life, but had never shared it with anyone. It had been collecting dust in the bank's possession. And with his death looming, he had no one to whom he could leave his fortune. However, John made a drastic decision. John had always been a bit of a Scrooge, so to make amends, he decided to give away at least half of his vast fortune to various charities. But the question of what he was going to do with the rest of his money remained. And of course, he has a plethora of restaurants. The only people John had been close to in the last 2 decades were the senior staff members of his restaurants, specifically the restaurant owners and managers. He rarely spoke to anyone other than them because he didn't have time for it. Could they be deserving of inheriting his wealth? The more John considered it, the more he began to wonder if he knew these men at all. John wished for his money to go to people with a good heart, as he believed they would be able to put it to good use. But how could he tell if his bosses met these requirements? John devised a strategy after consulting with the person he hired to handle his will. He dressed up as a homeless man and went to his own restaurants to see how the managers and other employees reacted to him upon seeing what he looked like. John is the owner of 3 restaurants in his hometown alone. This is where he would begin his research. He began by visiting his largest restaurant, which was well known throughout the state. However, the way his coworkers treated him there brought tears to his eyes. When he walked into the restaurant, both guests and staff gave him strange looks because it's not very common for a homeless man to just walk into an expensive and fancy restaurant. So he didn't have to wait long for the manager to approach him, and he was enraged. The homeless man was ordered to leave the restaurant immediately by the restaurant manager. John explained that he was hungry and hadn't had a good meal in days, but the manager refused to believe him. He quickly escorted John out the back door. Even the chef shouted on his way out that if he was hungry, he could find yesterday's leftovers in the restaurant's trash can and that it would still be the best meal he had ever had. John was dissatisfied with his employees and hoped that his luck would turn in other restaurants. John decided not to reveal his true identity just yet and instead went to his other well-known restaurant a few miles away. He had high hopes when he arrived at the restaurant that he would be treated better, but things quickly deteriorated. When he opened the door, a waitress rushed up to him and demanded that he leave immediately. When he refused, she contacted her manager, who informed him that he was not permitted to even order a drink in this establishment. But this time, John had devised a strategy. John explained to the manager that he used to be a regular customer and an old friend of the restaurant owner, but that his business had gone bankrupt and he now had nothing. He went on to say that if the manager called the owner, he would remember him. John already knew he wouldn't be leaving any money to this manager, but he wanted to at least give him a chance to realize his mistakes. He intended to pick up the phone when the manager dialed the boss and then reveal his true identity. However, things did not go as planned. The manager laughed and told the homeless man that he was the owner himself and that he needed to leave the restaurant quickly before he called the cops. John was dissatisfied with his staff and the way they treated the homeless. John began to realize that this attitude of being unconcerned about homeless people was likely present in all of his establishments. This may not come as a surprise given that all of these restaurants are located in high-end neighborhoods, but John had no such excuse. He had planned to keep his restaurants open after he died and hand over ownership to the managers in charge. He thought this would be a good way to thank them for their years of service. But after what he had witnessed today, he wasn't so sure. Perhaps concentrating solely on expensive and luxurious restaurants was a mistake. Perhaps lowering the cost of the food would attract and breed a different type of employee. You might gain more sympathy for people who are less fortunate if you deal with them frequently, John reasoned. But before making any drastic decisions, John decided to give one of his restaurants another chance. It was the last one in the city, and even though John didn't have much hope that he'd get a different response, he felt compelled to give it a shot. John was becoming increasingly concerned that his mission would fail, and he was considering donating all of his money to charity rather than just half. He was also considering selling all of his restaurants. The managers were unworthy of a penny, and John would have gladly fired them on the spot if he could. When he arrived, a security guard approached him before he even stepped inside. John's heart began to sink into his shoes. It was clear that he would not be treated any differently in this place. John was prepared to be disappointed once more, but this time things would be different. John considered revealing his true identity to the manager and informing him of the opportunity he had just missed. But John also realized that if 3 of his restaurants reacted in the same way to a homeless man, he, the owner, had to bear some responsibility. It felt like it was time for John to give up. He had no idea what he wanted to do next. He felt compelled to make significant changes in his company and personnel, but he knew he didn't have enough time left on this planet to do so. Now all John wanted to do was go home. John chose to walk around the restaurant's back. He had parked his high-end vehicle there to avoid attracting unwanted attention. As he rounded the corner, his gaze was drawn to a young woman sitting on the sidewalk adjacent to the restaurant. She was dressed as a waitress. John had apparently discovered the girl relaxing in the quiet of the alleyway. She was eating her lunch at the time. She invited the homeless man to come over when she noticed him. John was taken aback because this was the first person to notice him and treat him with respect. Julia was the young lady's name, and she had been working as a dishwasher in the restaurant for 6 months. She was occasionally permitted to assist in the restaurant, and this is where her true passion lies. When the two started talking, Julia told John about her tragic past. She ran her own business before coming to work at the restaurant. However, because she had entered into business with a bad partner, her entire company quickly went bankrupt, leaving her with nothing. In these trying times, not even her parents could help her. She applied for a job as a dishwasher at the restaurant to get her life back on track, but this was not her passion. She fantasized about opening her own restaurant and making people happy. She had no idea what was about to happen to her. She asked the homeless man if he was hungry and if she could help him after telling him her story. John explained to the girl that he simply wanted to eat in the restaurant, but that all of his co-workers had treated him badly and disrespectfully. Despite the fact that she didn't have much money, she insisted on giving John the last of her lunch. She told him stories about herself while he was eating. Throughout their conversation, John felt a growing sense of sympathy for the girl and realized he had finally found the right person. John was so overcome with emotion that he decided to remove his disguise and reveal his true identity. The owner of the restaurant was immediately recognized by the girl. She had a lot of questions, but the first one she had was why the owner had dressed up as a homeless man, and his response had a profound effect on her. John shared his sad story with her, explaining that he had only a few months to live after being diagnosed with an incurable disease, and that he wanted to use his remaining time to help others. But it was what he said after that that the girl had never dared to imagine. He made a well-considered but far-reaching decision about the future of his restaurants because the girl was the only one who treated him as a human. He wanted his legacy to be in good hands, so he decided to give the girl ownership of all of his restaurants. The girl was overjoyed and couldn't believe what he had just told her. She was relieved to know that her future was secure after years of struggling with money. She wanted to help, but she knew it would be a race against the clock because of John's illness. Despite the fact that he only had a few months left, John was content and confident that his legacy would be passed down to a good person. He was very happy when he got home. This positive feeling, however, would soon come to an end. John died a few months later, and the girl became the proud owner of all the restaurants. Despite the fact that she struggled at first with the enormous responsibility that was placed on her shoulders, she was able to expand the restaurants even further. She opened a restaurant where the homeless could get a free small meal every night. She did it as a tribute to John and a thank you for everything he has done for her. She would not be where she is today if it weren't for him. The restaurant for the homeless people was a success, and she was able to expand to other cities shortly after. She felt satisfied because she received a lot of praise for her hard work.